I know both Robert and I have some time commitments on the back end, so we'll keep this focused as we go through. And as always, Bethany is here to ensure that all the technology is working and everyone's coming through. If there's any sound issues or video issues, just let us know as we get rolling. So yeah, our program today is looking at after the assessment. And the idea here is that hopefully many of you have picked up on this issue, I think, in the threat assessment field is really a well-deserved switch from threat assessment to threat management and mitigation. And I was personally happy to see that focus change where we moved into the sort of what happens next. Because I think the assessment part for a while was prioritized, and the idea of how do we manage people over time is much more of, I think, an interesting topic and one that's full of interesting challenges. So as always, we want to hear your feedback. If you have this link, we'll put it into the chat a little later in the program as well. We're always very interested in hearing from you how we can do these programs better. I will mention these are our free series of programs. So if we were doing this as a 90-minute training with just your school or your group, it would be a lot more detailed, a lot more material. So these are really designed as more of, if you're joining us for the first time, kind of an introduction to the topic at hand. So without further ado, let me turn you over to Robert to tell us who he is and why he's here.
Thanks, Brian. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's morning here in California. So I am in Ventura County, which is just north of Los Angeles. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in California and Arizona. To do a good bit of work in the school safety realm. Brian and I have connected around our work in the threat field. And I also work quite a bit with schools and workplaces around the longer term management of these cases, which is why this topic today is really interesting to me. I think a lot of it comes from my earlier professional life working in the forensic mental health field, where I was oftentimes involved in both on the assessment end, but also really working with people post arrest, post conviction, and really kind of walking with them through their life, through usually oftentimes a pretty significantly long crisis as they were going through something really difficult. So I'm excited to be here today and just to offer thoughts and have some dialogue about this topic.
So my name is Brian Van Brunt. I'm the Director of Behavior and Threat Management at DPREP Safety, and I've been working for quite some years on some similar things that Robert mentioned, doing outpatient therapy, directing counseling centers, and working with BIT and care teams in this threat assessment process. And like Robert, I find myself just much more fascinated on the risk management over time piece. I think especially around things like student hospitalizations and the like, what would end up happening is just this over focus, I think, in some ways of getting the kid into the hospital and a lack of focus on what, like, they're going to solve everything at the hospital and they'll get out. Like Robert, having spent some time, probably should preface that, in the hospital settings, the idea there of knowing that everything's not going to get fixed during that time. And in fact, many times it gets worse. People who haven't been hospitalized before being hospitalized the first time, being in a place where they, everything was bad. Now it's even worse because now I've been committed, sometimes against my will, to be in a place. The idea of management is just, I think, such a cool concept to really dive into as we get forward. So Robert, we kind of think about this program, and I think both of us have a lot of case studies that we could teach, and what we did a little bit was kind of summarize, and we'll kind of drop into case experience. But I guess from the get-go, one of the things I'll mention is we really wanted to approach this both from say a student had an issue, say it was a harm to self or harm to others, and they were separated from campus, and then upon return there are some requirements, some things that we're putting on them, or that things that they have to produce for us before they come back. That would be some of the conditions we'd work on. I do think there's room, though, very much to talk about student behavior that might occur on campus of concern, and they're still on campus, so there hasn't been a separation, where counseling and the BIT and care teams sometimes could be in a place of helping with that sanctioning process, almost as subject matter experts, to make sure that we're not, I like to say, Robert, kind of Goldilocksing it, that we're not like going ridiculously too far in terms of what we're requiring, or the opposite, ridiculously too little in terms of what we should and can require for students who are engaging in behaviors that are concerning to either themselves or the community.
No, well, yeah, I think when I think of these cases, it's recognizing there's just so many different parties that are involved too, and it's the balancing the multiple needs in the cases. right? It's recognizing there's maybe the person, the identified person that's had the suicide attempt, they've made a threat, and then there's community that they're they're residing within. And then if they've made a threat against someone, that person and the needs of that person. And so, yeah, this idea of balance is, to me, like one of the biggest challenges we face, and requires a lot of thought and kind of looking at the different sides of the issue.
These, I think, play out in different ways. We'll just kind of pop them all up for you as we talk about them and kind of give a dealer choice on these. Robert, maybe I'll grab like length of time away as a
Yeah.
first spot, and you can kind of grab one next. But I think one of the errors that we find, and I'm going to use it as the word error because I think that's accurate, is we end up either sanctioning someone or conduct sanctions someone, and there's like this the thing that the lawyers hate. I don't know why they keep doing it, but there's this like arbitrary and capricious standard of like they're going to go away from us for some time. And I have trouble imagining anything beyond a year really being reasonable for a college to require a 2, 5, 10-year separation. Just seems, again, arbitrary and capricious on that level. And really, should we be talking about expulsion and removal completely at that stage? If the issue is that egregious, like really, why would we look at that? So I think the psychology of it fascinates me. I think it often occurs by a very well-meaning dean or small committee where they say, well, I don't know, how long do you think? Oh, about a year sounds good. And that's part of the problem, that when we're doing sanctions, to have them tied to the issue at hand, to having an awareness of how long a person might be away, to make sure that we're really clear about the expectations when they come back, that we don't want to have something overly punitive. I can't tell you how many times I find myself consulting with colleges where they're surprised that the person resurfaced at some point, that they've gone away, they did a 3-year ban from campus, and then suddenly the 3 years are up and their entire life is around, I just always wanted to come back to XYZ school, and here they are. They hope, and this is part of the issue too with long bans, they're sort of hoping they'll go find somewhere else to be. And that to me goes against the whole point of a good conduct process or sanctioning, that we're really looking at having them do some work so that when they are ready to return, they're able to come back in and accomplish the goals that are in front of them.
Yeah, it speaks to, I guess, what is the intention? What are we hoping happens from the length away? And really, reasonably, how long will it take for that to potentially occur? And what we know is that it does really vary for folks that are struggling maybe with a mental health concern. But right, the idea that we're just going to sort of across the board, well, it's automatically a year or it's automatically 2 years, sometimes doesn't sit well too. It doesn't make sense. And I think when sanctions really don't make sense, that's when we oftentimes have pushback.
If any others here kind of jump out to you to start with, Robert, I can certainly grab any of them. But
the whole issue around cost assessments and treatment. So let's say what has been recommended or the requirement is they need to do a psych eval or a violence risk assessment. Who's going to pay for that? What I find oftentimes, and I've seen this change over time, I think 5 years ago, oftentimes it was students that were required to pay for that. What I see more is institutions taking on that cost. And I think there's obvious benefits to that for the institution to cover that cost, making sure, having some sort of role in making sure who's doing the assessment is actually qualified to do the assessment. But that information is super valuable to the institution. Whereas the treatment piece is oftentimes then the requirement of the student. But that really looks different for different students. For some students, it's not an issue. They come from a family maybe that has the resources or they have insurance. But for other students, the idea of having to do ongoing treatment is a huge issue. And there are major barriers to them being able to pay for treatment or even access treatment, depending on if they've been removed from the institution. I've seen that in a few cases where maybe they've been in an LA area school, but now they're going home to rural wherever, and there just aren't the resources to actually even meet the treatment, or the cost is well beyond what they can afford.
I think so as well. And I think making sure too, I think sometimes it's like a buffet approach, like, well, we can kind of do whatever we want, so let's just start adding things to this. And I've watched the NA requirements, or AA requirements, things like, well, we need a forensic mental health evaluator. And it's like, well, do you? Because Forensic means court involved. So right off the bat, when you say forensic, it means somehow they're involved in the criminal or civil court. So is that the case? So, or what kind of evaluation are you looking for? Many times we'll find doctors, sometimes ER doctors, being put into positions of writing letters of return. So, as the student goes away, there's a lot of different issues that we talk about and train on to try to avoid some of those difficulties. But your point about availability and distance to treatment and what is it exactly that they need? Sometimes there's this like mission creep, even when a student's staying on campus, where we find behaviors in the classroom suddenly result in a sanction or ban for the residence hall when there's not really a connection necessarily between the two, or vice versa. And being aware of that and making sure that the behavior itself that we're addressing is tied to the sanctioning piece and the educational piece moving forward. Like, I think that's a good way to consider some of these areas as well. And I would agree with you, Robert, too. I think the common experience I'm having is the assessment part, especially prior to like adjudication or a finding in the conduct space. Certainly the schools are paying for those assessments. The assessments that are required prior to return to campus, I see them often paying for those as well, maybe a little less frequently. The assessments that are then tied to treatment, it's fairly rare for the college section to pay, for the treatment, but I think that does occur as well.
Yeah, I'll also comment about the AANA meeting so one of my roles at an institution was the alcohol and drug program coordinator, and before I came in they didn't have a person, so everybody who had an alcohol or drug sanction, they required him to go to 10 meetings. And again, this is not a knock on AA or NA, but we really want to, is it an appropriate recommendation? And so having more of an assessment, which I think most schools oftentimes now are doing, because what we would find is sometimes if they weren't really a match for AA or NA, what they would come away from those meetings with is, oh, I'm not that bad and I don't really have an issue. And so it really backfire. Our intention of the sanction was good, but it actually made things worse and was not helpful.
And I don't want to draw the ire of all the counseling center directors on the call, but we have some blame in that space. That I think there's the growth of counseling as students come in to see us, the mission creep into other areas, and the length of wait lists and such. And it's rare that counseling centers have the ability to invest either in a LADAC or some of the tools that a substance abuse program might benefit from. I've been lucky to have always done that at our programs that I've run, using tools like the SASE, excellent one that we've used before. But even something as simple as the CAGE questionnaire, or some essential conversations with those students in that psychoeducational space, choices, and the well-loved program eChug, which
eChug, that's what I eat. eChug and eToke.
We got to get it. eToke being its sister program, which is now clearly renamed eCheckup to Go because someone got marketing on those. But like that just seems so much more practical. So many better conversations have come out of that. Like I think there's absolutely a place for AA. It's a great program. I would endorse it. It's the same problem though that you get depending on where you are and who's attending the meetings. Is that giving the kind of messaging we want to give to the students, which by the way is some of the same arguments I might have for an inpatient psychiatric evaluation, that we can have times where it seems like this is the place that deals with it, but when we really look at the problem, is that truly going to make things better, or is it just stopgap?
Actually, this is a snow globe. And I for me, what it depicts is what happens after the assessment. Is there is a settling process that is occurring. And again, I draw a lot from my work with in higher ed, when people have been removed or taking a medical leave, it's a really dynamic situation. And sometimes we get to the end of our process and we're like, okay, we're done. We've said the recommendations and we can just move on. And yet there's still a lot happening. There's a lot happening for the person and that student and that student's family. And it's just really having to appreciate how dynamic of what's happening when they leave the assessment. And so for me, it's always the best picture. So I know we'll talk about like what really makes a good plan. I think it's really appreciating that a plan is dynamic. We'll have recommendations, but know that oftentimes there's some curveballs that are going to come in. We have a plan. There's a thoughts on where treatment may occur, where they may be living, those sorts of things. And then something happens and it goes off track. There's a lot of things that happen oftentimes after the assessment, after recommendations are made, and particularly like when a student is returning to the community. Maybe they aren't being separate. There isn't a separation from the institution. Maybe it's more they're coming back, but now they're doing treatment, but now they're in the community and people are having reactions to them being in the community. How does the case plan respond to those reactions? So that's my snow globe. Yeah.
I like it. I like the settling metaphor, and I like the idea of the stuff that happens. Like we all have like this, everything's settled, and someone shakes it. Like that's a cool metaphor. I like that a lot. I think that managing the requirements, these are some lessons that I think both Robert and I have learned over the years related to when we're managing things, when we're managing behaviors or difficulties. And this is something we can drill down to a little bit in the Q&A, some good practices. And I'll grab the first one again, Robert. Like, I think the problem that I see frequently is when we're doing sanctioning or doing this work, when it gets close to the deadline, that's when everyone starts to say, hey, did that student do that? And that really reflects the lack of follow through and connection. And while it's easy in some way to just put that all on the student and say, well, they knew the requirements and whether they're coming back, I think we're all eating the meal, right? Like, so we should care about how the process is carried out all the way through. Because if the student comes back and they've done a bad process and just checked off the tick marks, in the end, college is going to pay for that as well, because the behavior isn't changed and they're going to see it recircling and occurring on campus. So there's a vested interest for everyone involved to say, how can we work together in, dare I say, a case management oriented approach to make sure that that student's getting through the requirements, and not just the letter of the law, like the check marks on them, but truly, like, are they learning and progressing in this space in a way that's probably akin to the prison or jail system? Has there been perhaps like a rehabilitation or a reflection or a restorative justice process that they've gone through that's actually helped?
As you're talking about that, I'm thinking about the opportunity to affirm what they're doing right as they're following through with the process. I see it as there's opportunity to restore the relationship with that student. And as we catch them on the right path, really builds, I think it builds a better opportunity when they come back, that we have a better relationship with that student. And I've seen that happen. You continue in this dialogue, and the case manager or whoever's managing the case really develops a different relationship with that student. And when they come back, it's like, it's almost like a built-in mentor that's been created.
When we can train them to those people, and I've met them too as well, Robert, they're great. And understanding this interplay between, say, risk and protective factors and support, that a good plan can't be simply keep them away from all the bad stuff. And I go back to an AA metaphor here. Like, it can't just be, as we're working with this student, let's identify all the problem areas, keep them away from drinking, and 1 drink becomes 5 drinks, and they shouldn't drink when they're emotional, and stay away from those people when they're drinking because that makes them drink more. And so when all that is the entirety of the plan, it loses the other half, which I think AA picks up on well, which is we get you a plant and a sponsor and meetings, and they're face to face, and there's a connection. So like, the good part of the AA metaphor, I think, is this connection to each other and really increasing the supports. And another way to say that is filling that hole that's left from what happened before. So it's not enough just to mitigate the risk factors. It has to be, how do we increase that scaffolding, those protective or anchor factors that are there as well. And having a key person, ideally a case manager, someone from the BIT or care team who's in charge of keeping an eye on those things. I don't want to make too much of a push on a probationary or probation officer kind of connection, but I think there's something fair to be said about that. A good probation officer watching them while they're away or as they're progressing, ensuring that they're giving them every opportunity for success.
And I think tied into that is sort of that, but thinking ahead in terms of even the conditions under which the separation is occurring. And so having that requirement, the check-in with them, and there is the check-in with the treatment providers along the way. And it's a little more work on the front end, but I think, as you alluded to, oftentimes it really prevents the big surprise at the end, either that they haven't been following through, or there's been some sort of issue, maybe not even the student's fault, that has gotten in the way of them being able to get the help that they need, an opportunity to help out. Yeah.
I'm going to leave you in Robert's hands to finish off here on what makes a good plan. I do have to step away for another engagement. I wanted to be here at least for the beginning of this. The other thing I'll mention is I think between Robert and I, the idea of putting up a sample case that actually writes up for you. And so you can see an example of a good mitigation plan, and maybe even one for a student who hasn't left campus and it's an ongoing continuous plan, like what we would see being important in there. We can give you some sample language, as well as someone who's left campus and upon return, what some of that language might look like as we move forward. So we'll get that up in a day or two attached to today's program. So those of you looking for some sample language and examples of good mitigation planning and discussion, we'll make sure that you have access to that. So I'll turn over the car keys to Robert and to Bethany. And
Good. Thanks, Brian.
All right, Robert, I will pop the slides back up for you.
All right, great. And if there are questions, please put them in the chat. Happy to have conversation, or if there's any of these things that are standing out related to cases you've dealt with or are dealing with currently. Brian, talking about reality therapy and Glasser, the planning part is, again, I think we have sort of the intention of what we want to see happen, and yet the plan isn't always thought through in a really specific way. And there's a lot of different ways to think about goal setting or plan setting. I like the smart goal setting. And I think these are really similar to this too. But the more we can simplify and break things down to where they aren't, the goals and the plan isn't 10 things under item number 1, the easier it is for people to be able to take that in. The second part is the attainable. And this is where we have to kind of work with the student, putting out a recommendation. We have to think about, given their circumstance, given where they live, given what their means are, is this something that they could be successful? We all have been in that situation maybe where we've been asked to do something that is just beyond our resources, and how hopeless that feels. And thinking about the student in the position, sometimes they may not even say, I don't think I can do this, because they're fearful that if they push back, something negative is going to happen. So I think it's taking the extra step, really kind of thinking about, is the plan realistic? Can they meet them? And is it something that can be measured? And sometimes this is tough with treatment, because we oftentimes don't know treatment-wise, how long of treatment do they need, but we at least know we need to give them something to aim for in terms of the length of time or number of sessions, getting a recommendation, something that they can really point to and we can measure and they can measure and we can have agreement on. Both those immediate and then the longer term goal. When we give people by a certain date, let's identify a treatment provider or identify a couple of options. So that in this day and age, we know that sometimes starting mental health treatment takes a long time because it's hard to find people are full, but at least if they can have started to do some work, it gives us some feedback, that they're starting to do the process and they've had a success. They can't always control when they start. Yeah, just the other parts is just giving them some ability to have control in the plan. Just a good plan is consistently practiced, and there's some commitment to it and buy-in and investment. So a lot of times it occurs through conversation. It's not just sort of giving the plan to the person. It's really having that conversation with them about the plan. And I think tied to that is just sort of while they're separated or they're not separated while they're going through treatment, but what if let's say they're separated from the institution, what is the specific reentry requirement? What type of assessment are we requiring? The more specific, and we want it to be relevant, the assessment to be relevant to the issue. If someone has made a threat, or maybe they've made a threat, but are also suicidal, we may want a psych and risk assessment evaluation. If our concern is more around their propensity for violence, then really we're wanting specifically the violence risk assessment, but really spelling that out and spelling out what do we need in that assessment. Okay, we oftentimes know what we're looking for. We're looking for someone who knows how to use evidence-based risk assessment tool, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen people do a violence risk assessment and it's literally the subjective opinion of a person with no training. So we need to spell out the reentry requirement and what we're looking for in that evaluation. Are we recommending the psych treatment, or are we looking more for a psychoeducational intervention? And that's just going to depend on oftentimes what comes out of the initial evaluation. Is this someone who just needs more information and will benefit from some insight and some reflection, or is this someone who's really dealing with more serious underlying issues of depression or psychosis? Really being clear about the no contact restrictions. So if they're a threat to others, are they clear about what that means? What does no contact mean? Easier kind of thinking no contact when they're away. What does that mean on campus? Does that mean I can be in the cafeteria when they're there, or how do I make those decisions? And that's a hard one. When they're coming back and there's a no contact order, that's one that needs a lot of thinking through and really helping the person figure out how to be successful at that. Are you going to require substance testing? And I know it's a controversial topic. Are we going to have that part of it? And what's the purpose of it? Is the purpose of it sort of to catch them messing up, or is it really tied into accountability and really trying to help them be successful in their return? And whether we're requiring medication, and again, controversial, really hard to do. We're oftentimes basing that off of a recommendation from an assessment that's been required, but ultimately a really difficult one to enforce. A, we don't know whether they're doing it, and B, there's lots of questions whether we can really require that at all. So lots of things to think about, but wanting to be really clear about, what it is we're requiring. Is it reasonable? Helping the student make sense as to why we're requiring it too. And, and oftentimes, we're getting into where parents are involved and asking questions, and then making sure the students giving us permission and giving us a release, we can really take the time to do that. I have had many cases over the years where I, again, taking the student and the parent who was super pissed off, really having a difficult time with these things, but through conversation, then becoming one of the biggest supporters of what we do. They don't all turn out that way, but I find that the little extra work oftentimes goes a long way. Yeah, and just kind of some themes just in terms of helping the student, helping they overcome the obstacles. And I think it's, as we kind of lay out the plan, we want to work as collaboratively as possible, like we do in motivational interviewing. We're laying out the expectations, but then how it's done or how it's implemented or helping them work through the obstacles can be very collaborative. So as we, and I think like even the conversation around the sanction or the requirements is best done via Zoom or some way very personally, not just showing up in an email. Not to say that it doesn't need to show up in an email for making sure they're clear, but really being able to talk through those requirements, helping them eliciting that feedback from them and their thoughts about the requirements. What concerns do you have? Not that you're going to change the requirement, but really helping them problem solve and work through it. I think of a case we had, student had numerous suicide attempts and then had made a threat towards a student. They were separated from the college, but then had to move back to a really rural part of another country. And so the requirement was this student really needed psych help, needed therapy, needed to see a psychiatrist, but really didn't have, in their town, did not have access to those things. So we spent a lot of time really exploring with them, were there no resources, or were there some things a little bit outside their area? But then we came up with some amazing telehealth options for the student that they were completely unaware of. We didn't know. We know that service delivery has really changed, particularly since COVID. And what used to be pretty inaccessible is now much more accessible in some cases. So it was an example of like student really being upset about the requirements, concerned they couldn't meet them, to them having a pretty amazing treatment experience, virtually being able to get this psychiatry help that they wouldn't have been able to get in their own town. It was a really good outcome. Kind of helping them understand the expectations. I think we've kind of talked a little bit about that already today. I live and work in the mental health field all the time. And so I throw around language and acronyms just like it's common language. Yet oftentimes students who are going through this process, it's their first interaction with the mental health process, with the mental health system, and they may have a lot of feelings about that, or they just don't understand what things mean or how to even access things. So I really think we have to slow down and really having this conversation, even having them just repeat back this list of expectations. Tell me what your understanding is of what we're asking of you. And really trying to see if they're processing it. Because I find oftentimes, they'll shake their head and they'll say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I got to go do these things. But there's really a lack of clarity around that. So I think going that extra step and really asking them, having them put it into their own words, what it is we're asking them to do, helps us really get a sense of do they understand it. Really being an advocate for them where we can. I think when Brian started out and really talking about sanctions, and maybe a lot of you have been at the table where different people have different ideas about what they think should happen. I think of threat assessment teams I've sat in on where the range of ideas ranges from, okay, let's get the person some help, to expulsion, complete separation. And so really trying to be an advocate where we can, using evidence and really trying to help people understand what is going to be both in the student's best interest, but also the institution's best interest. Over punishing or providing a sanction that is well beyond really what meets the need or meets the threshold of what has happened. It's a place where we can advocate. I think it's also, I think of being an advocate too, when there's been a separation in particular. One of the first questions that comes up, let's say it's 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the semester. And the first thought is, oh my gosh, I'm getting A's and B's in my classes and I'm going to lose all the credit. Are there places where it's appropriate to advocate the academic dean or whoever does that at your institution for an incomplete or the ability to complete the class off campus? Or have a discussion with financial aid. A lot of times if students separated for a certain period of time, they're going to lose that financial aid. And is there a place we can advocate and assist and help where we can? I think it's then it's recognizing that when students are in the situation is that there is a sense of hopelessness. And it gets pretty dark for people when they come out of this. I oftentimes just think of what it's like, that student, and oftentimes whether it's their first semester student or a soon to be graduating senior, of a separation or something interrupting their education is devastating. It's much like get a referral from an attorney who's someone who's recently been arrested. It's like their life is flashing before them. The way things were, they oftentimes will go to a very dark place that my life is over. And so in that, it's why we're concerned, even if they haven't maybe been suicidal before, we are concerned when these sanctions come down. It's oftentimes a place of risk for them to spiral and become depressed. And we want to, again, not rose-colored glasses on, tell them everything's going to be okay, but really help them see a path forward, help them see what can come from this, offer examples where, hey, this, you're not the first person that's been in this situation. It's really hard. So it's being empathic with them, but also helping them see what can come from this. I think of a case recently I assessed of a young man who had made a pretty serious threat. And as I was evaluating him, and his dad was part of it, what came to be was this was a student who had been having hallucinations for 10 years, undiagnosed, never had any treatment, really tons of childhood trauma. And even though the loss of the opportunity to continue that semester was significant, we really talked about what it would be like if those other things could be improved. And this student, I will tell you, it was one of these success stories. And following it, the student got on medication, started to get therapy. Truly, their life changed. And I know not all cases turn out that way, but oftentimes in the midst of these crises, there are opportunities and staying involved and helping trying to be hopeful with, but also empathic and balance. I get how difficult this is, and here's some ways hopefully things could be helpful to you. We want to try to balance that.